Like I already told you a little bit how, the Dutch are like so afraid of the Muslims throughout history. They've always tried to forcefully convert Muslims. They've tried to prosecute Muslims. They've tried to unalive them. And they've also, incited hate in the Muslim community. For example, in this Padri War that I mentioned, the Dutch came in, they wanted to create more conflict between the two sides, started, supporting the side that was less Islamic. They were still gambling. They were still drinking alcohol. They were still, doing drugs. And well, I'm not sure about the drugs, but anyways, they were still doing bad things that were harmful for themselves, and the Dutch wanted to support them. And they started this campaign against the other side saying, they are the extremists. You should fight them. The Dutch, they had a very problematic presence in Indonesia, I would say, where they were very calculated about the way that they were trying to occupy the lands and exploit the people. And at that time, it's funny because when I read about these things, I can see very clearly that these occupiers were more openly fighting Islam than they are today. Today, I would say that most occupiers are carrying a lot of these false flag missions to hurt Muslims. And then, for example, say that Muslims are the ones who are extremists in non-Muslim countries. Or when Muslims get attacked, they pretend other Muslims attacked them. That's what occupiers do nowadays. Back in the day, they were a little bit less, I would say, calculated about it. For example, the Indonesians, they would openly be subjected to these tactics by their colonizer, their occupier, which were meant to weaken them. For example, the Dutch tried to use Hajj for political reasons. They were offering it to Indonesian leaders who would submit to them as an occupier. Mashallah, the Indonesians rejected. Okay? Another thing they would do is the Indonesians who were in Mecca and couldn't receive money anymore from their family members in Indonesia to continue their studies because the Dutch blocked it. The Dutch would say, okay, we will give you money if you accept us as your leaders. The Indonesians rejected it. Okay. Another thing the Dutch would do to, squirm their way into the Muslim community and, create conflict, weaken them, and to exploit them is the Dutch would go to Saudi Arabia and they were trying to put political influence on the sheikhs there who were guiding Hajj visitors. And so they would say to the Saudis who were there guiding the Indonesians, if you start to influence the people who are doing pilgrimage and say this and this and this to them, that would be very, very beneficial to us. But they also rejected that. Another example, right, of how Muslims worldwide, not just the Indonesians, they went there even to Mecca to try to campaign against, the Indonesians. And the Dutch did that. And it didn't work because the Muslims were standing united. And that's how you overcome occupation. The Dutch were being very sneaky, trying to sabotage Muslims, using Islam to blackmail Indonesians, dedicated Muslims. They were trying to say to them, you can only do Hajj if you accept our leadership. You can only do this if you accept our leadership. At some point, the Dutch even banned Hajj. It was not accessible for Indonesians anymore to punish them. And that should tell you a lot about how much they feared the Islam in Indonesia. Because for them, it wasn't just bullying the Indonesians. Okay. It wasn't just bullying Indonesians by taking away something that means so much to them. It was also about making sure they couldn't go to the Holy Land and get, knowledge and get educated. And so that's what the Dutch would do. They wanted to, if the Indonesians would go to Saudi Arabia, they wanted to control the process. They wanted to control the shipping. They wanted to control how they were doing Hajj, performing Hajj, how they were being guided. by the Saudis. They wanted to influence everything by, shoving down these narratives down the throats of Indonesians. But Indonesians were strong, mashallah. They were smart, mashallah. They weren't like, oh, I need a little bit of money. Let me take that money. No, they weren't like the leaders, weren't like, oh, I want to get more power. Let me accept, this offer by the Dutch and then betray my own people. No. They were not like that. And that's why I am such a fan of them. They're so, they're inspirational. They're example. They're role models. They should be role models to Muslims worldwide. Okay. Anyways, one thing that's really difficult nowadays is that because there's so many fake narratives about Muslims that are being pushed, a lot of Muslims don't know anymore, what to believe. Like sometimes it's like even these media outlets who pretend to be, with the Muslims. They talk about Palestine. They talk about, the oppression of Muslims here and there. But then here and there, they'll also throw in, some type of propaganda against the Muslims. And that's something that I think Muslims need to be very aware of. Not everyone who looks like they are your friend is your friend. You need to think, okay? And I get so tired of Muslims online when I see you attacking each other based on these dumbass articles written by actual non-Muslims, and then you go around attack Muslims. You attack Muslims based on the words of a non-Muslim who's lying makes me nauseous. It makes me nauseous. That's what I can tell you. Okay. Anyways, this is what I wanted to tell you about Mecca. And I just think it's so cool. I think the whole thing is so cool. And here's another thing that really came to my mind though, and which obviously I read here as well. I read an article about Indonesians in Mecca by this Turkish, I think it was a Turkish lecturer or professor. And he basically talked about, the significance of Mecca for Indonesians. And one thing he also described was that how, there was obviously so much controversy around Indonesians going to Mecca because the Dutch were trying to block it. But at the same time, the Indonesians were also trying to, campaign in Mecca to, get the Saudis and get all the other Indonesians to become one front against the occupiers. What I think is I would say it's beautiful about Mecca though, and in Saudi Arabia, is that they didn't allow this type of political campaigning going on in Mecca. Okay. Because it is a holy city. It's a country that also has its distinct, relationships with other countries. And so for them, they cannot be pulled into every war just because, they're a holy city as well.